The author of many books. Here's one where he's worked together, a book on Tsongkhapa by Geshe and Geshe Noang Samten, who some of you know through our center, and Jay Garfield. Jay has another book that's just come out called Engaging Buddhism, about how Buddhist philosophy connects with the Western tradition of philosophy, or how it should connect, I think you would say, with the Western tradition of philosophy. There's many topics he could speak to us about. Tonight he's agreed to speak about Buddhism between philosophy and religion. If you go to the United States and you meet Buddhists there, they think, oh, Buddhism isn't a religion, it's a philosophy. And this, this is something people maybe want to know. What does this mean? What does it mean when someone says Buddhism is a philosophy instead of a religion? So maybe Jay will talk to us about this tonight. Something about his own experience, his own path to scholarship, and his own personal interest. And then we'll have some time for questions. Let me just check. Wayne, Jay will be speaking for about how long? Ordinarily? Wayne is the boss. We have
Until I stop.
Okay, all right.
Until they're all asleep.
Well, then you go, girl. And you speak until you run out of things to say, and then we'll ask questions and make you speak some more. Please give a warm welcome to Jay Garfield.
And please feel free to interrupt me while I'm speaking too, because I can be really boring. And if you let me just drone on and on and on, you'll fall asleep. Is this too loud? This feels too loud to me. It's okay, really? Okay. I've never worn one of these before. It feels very strange. As I was saying, I'd like this to be very informal, and I'd like you to be willing to stop me, because if I'm coming out here, presumably I'm coming out here to say something of interest to you, and if it's not interesting, then I failed. You can make it more interesting by asking questions and objecting, throwing small objects at me, things like that. So please feel free to make things as interactive as you like. Now, John asked me to, and by the way, thank you very much for having me. That's the other thing. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. I know my friend Geshe Samten has taught here before, and he's a very old friend of mine, so it's kind of nice to teach in the same place that he's taught. And I've heard very good things about it. So, John asked me to talk about Buddhism between philosophy and religion. And I kind of agreed to do that without knowing what it meant, because I don't know what it means to be between philosophy and religion. And I also never quite know what philosophy is and what religion is and how they differ from one another, because that dichotomy as it's constructed in some places doesn't make sense in other places. So instead of getting hung up on the question of which of these particular departments Buddhist studies or Buddhist practice belongs in, I'd like to talk about something different but related. What I had in mind when he asked me if the title was okay. And that is, I want to talk about why, if you're interested in Buddhism and Buddhist practice, you better be interested in Buddhist philosophy. That is, so when I talk about Buddhist philosophy and religion, what I want to talk about is why Buddhist religious practice makes no sense unless you are also practicing Buddhist philosophy. I think that's really important. And I guess I'm going to begin with a wonderful discussion from a book that I recommend to you all as bedtime reading, if you're like me and you like to read at bedtime. I'm going to tell you about this book, and I'm going to tell you about a great line in the book, and then I'm going to back up from there. So the book is by Ippolito Desideri, who was the first Jesuit missionary. Would it be better if I just talk like this? Is this okay? Can I just talk like this? That's much more comfortable. Okay. Then I don't have to wear this jewelry. And then I won't make those strange noises. But it's making all this feedback. Okay, yeah, that'll be fine. Just so I don't make all the feedback noise. Yeah, they want to use you. Is that okay now? Okay, no feedback, good. I hate that feedback sound. So anyway, Ippolito Desideri was the first Jesuit missionary to Tibet, And he wrote memoirs called Travels to Tibet, and it's great bedtime reading. It's translated into English. I don't know about other languages. But there's this one part where Ippolito Desideri is talking about why Tibetans will make the world's best Catholics. He says, look, they have altars with images and candles. They burn incense. They have a clergy who wear robes and shave their heads. They chant in a language that most of the lay people can't understand. And most of all, they have a learned academic clergy, but millions of people who know nothing at all about their religion, but who are completely devoted to it. They're perfect Catholics. He was saying that in all seriousness. And unfortunately, I think that it's true. And it's true about a lot of Buddhists, not only in Tibet, but people who approach Buddhism outside of Tibet and outside of traditionally Buddhist places. It's that last part. It's not the part about the candles. It's not the part about the altars. It's this part about cultivating great faith in a religion that nobody understands. And my view is that if you're doing that, no matter how many prostrations you're doing, no matter how many Vajrasattva recitations you're doing, no matter how long you're sitting on a cushion and contemplating a beautiful image of the Buddha, what you're doing has nothing whatsoever to do with Buddhism. That's where I want to start. So a lot of people, when they ask the question, the very complicated question, gee, with all that, I'm going to back up in a different direction now. Buddhism, with all this philosophical study, and with all these guys on the wall who are all professors of philosophy, most of them at Nalanda, though not all of them, be careful about that. All of those guys and all of these guys who all earn PhDs in philosophy, Geshe degrees, right? So you're talking about a whole bunch of egghead philosophers. I just want to make that clear. All of these guys, you wonder if that's what Buddhism's about. People say, well, it's not really religion, it's just kind of an academic system. That's got to be wrong too. Because if you think about what a religion does in a culture, what the job of a religion is, if you want, Buddhism does that job a lot. That is, it organizes people's lives around important life events, births, deaths, marriages. It provides a situation where people come together to think about things that are transcendent. It is ritualized. Anybody who pretends there are no rituals in Buddhism hasn't been to a Buddhist study center. So it does all of these things that we expect a religion to do. What I want to say is that religious stuff, right, the stuff about births and deaths and prayers and candles and incense and images, is really has to be a subsidiary part of the whole operation. That's there as a kind of technology for generating faith and motivation. But if you focus on the technology instead of what it's about, you're not involved in Buddhist practice. So now I'm going to tell you what I think about Buddhist practice. And now I'm also going to tell you something else. I'm not a geshe, right? I've got hair, not much of it, but it's not because I shave it. I'm not wearing robes. I'm a regular old lay guy. So some of you might think, well, gee, then why bother listening? And if you're thinking that, then just go away, that's fine. But the fact is that Buddhism is got to be a place, and Buddhist study centers have to be a place, where people of all kinds can come and share ideas about Buddhism. So I'm going to be talking to you not from the throne, as somebody who's telling you what you ought to believe, and I'm not going to be talking to you from the throne as somebody representing a particular lineage. I'm going to be talking to you as me, somebody who's thought about Buddhism for a while, and I'm going to tell you what I think. So it ain't official, and you are free to disagree with me, and you are free to think that some of what I say is heretical, because it might be heretical. And sometimes a little heresy can't hurt you. So that's going to be the spirit in which I talk with you. Now, Buddhism as far as I'm concerned, is about one thing. It's about solving a problem. A very deep problem, a very pervasive problem, and the greatest moment of genius of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, was to really see deeply into this problem. And that is the problem of the universality of dukkha, of suffering. If you don't see suffering as a problem, then Buddhism has absolutely no use to you. If you don't have a headache, you don't take aspirin. If you don't, if you're not in financial trouble, you don't go to work. If you're not suffering, then you don't go to Buddhism. Because all Buddhism is about is solving the problem of suffering. And by the way, if you like suffering and think suffering is really good, then don't go to Buddhism, because Buddhism is about eliminating suffering. So again, it's kind of like it's an option, right? If you notice that the world is pervaded by suffering, and if you think that's a problem, then Buddhism might have something to say that can help you to solve that problem. So Buddhism is entirely about suffering. Now, but it's not all bad news, so that's the other thing. It's not all bad news, but it starts with bad news. It starts with bad news, namely that life is pervaded by suffering. And as you know, there are several different levels of suffering that we talk about in Buddhism. We talk about the suffering, the suffering of change, and the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And you guys know all about that, right? Because you're going to stop me the moment I say something you don't know about, right? Okay, you promise. You're not going to let me presume stuff, okay? So the thing about suffering is that the Buddha also figured out that suffering has a cause. And as you know, the proximal causes of suffering, the immediate causes of suffering, are attraction and aversion, wanting things that we can't have, not wanting things that we've got. But attraction and aversion themselves are conditioned by a deeper cause of suffering, and that is primal confusion. Sometimes translated as ignorance. I prefer to translate that as primal confusion. And I want to think about that for a minute, because that's why philosophy is important, okay? That's right where it is, it's right at the root. So, Jay Tsongkhapa, in this book that Geshe Samten and I translated, that John waved around for a little while, that really is bedtime reading. That'll put you to sleep really fast. But anyway, but in there, Jay Tsongkhapa says about primal confusion, he says, if you think that it's just ignorance, the absence of knowledge, then you don't understand what it is. Because it's not an absence, it's the positive superimposition of a conception of reality onto reality that doesn't fit. So it's a confusion, that is an imposition of one way of understanding reality on reality. And in particular, it's the view that things which are actually impermanent are permanent. The view that even though there is no self, that there is a self. The view that even things have no intrinsic identity, that they have intrinsic identity. And the view that even though things are interdependent, that some things can be independent. It's the reflexive superimposition of that view. Now, in a different book of Jay Rinpoche's, called Lekshe Nyingpo, the Essence of Eloquence, there's another very nice line that I like, where he says there's actually two kinds of confusion that are closely related. They're the same confusion, but they come from two different sources. One kind of confusion, one kind of misunderstanding the nature of reality, can just come from doing really bad philosophy. That is, you kind of think about things hard, and you think, God, I've got to have a soul. I've got to have a self, and there has to be a beginning to the universe. It's got to have been created by God, and it's got to go on forever. And you just kind of work this out with really bad arguments, okay? And hey, I'm completely independent. Here I am standing on my own 2 feet. My existence doesn't depend on anybody else, and just look, and everybody else is there. I'm right here, right? And so one way you can work your way into this is just doing really bad philosophy. And I've probably got colleagues who can help you with that if you want to do really bad philosophy. But Jay Rinpoche says that's not the kind of confusion we're talking about in Buddhism. Because really bad philosophy is easy to deal with. The way you deal with it is you do some good philosophy and you refute it, and then it's all done. That's me. But bad philosophy, isn't the source of most of our problems. You know why, he says? Most people aren't philosophers. So they don't even encounter bad philosophy, but they're already in trouble, okay? That most of our primal confusion about the nature of reality is what he calls innate, limke, primal confusion. That is, it's a confusion that's kind of, as we would put it in the language of modern neuroscience, it's kind of built into our cognitive architecture. We've evolved to be screwed up. We've evolved to get things wrong. And there are a lot of good reasons that evolution would make you get things wrong, because getting things wrong sometimes helps you stay alive. It's true, it's true. Sometimes error is a good thing. But it doesn't help you get happy, even if it helps you stay alive. And it does, in the end, cause a lot of suffering. And so, if we're talking about solving the ubiquitous problem of suffering in Buddhism, then we're talking about doing something to extirpate, to uproot this kind of innate primal confusion about the nature of reality. Now, just because it's innate, it doesn't mean it's not of you, right? I mean, after all, most of us grow up looking around saying, well, the earth is obviously flat. Even that might be built into us. That doesn't mean it's not of you, and it doesn't mean you don't have to do something about it. Most of us grow up thinking that we're kind of independent centers of the universe. And that's important because it enables us to kind of keep ourselves alive. But it's also maladaptive when we discover there's other people who believe falsely that they're the center of the universe. Then we need to fight. So even though this is all innate, it is an innate view, and it's got to be extirpated, and that's the job of philosophy. And so, excuse me, one of the reasons that so much Buddhist literature is closely argued philosophical literature, what all of those guys, the so-called 17 Londonosters, are up to, is providing arguments that are that if we understand them, are going to help us to extirpate that innate confusion that lies at the heart of suffering, whose removal is the very point of Buddhism in the first place. Now, that's so much for a preamble. That's meant to warm you up and say, damn, philosophy really is a good thing to do because I don't like suffering, and now I realize I suffer because I'm dumb, and the only way to stop being dumb is to do philosophy, so yes, I want to do philosophy. So that's the warm-up. Okay. Now, that's not enough to say. Because a lot of people, a lot of practitioners, a lot of very serious practitioners and meditators say, yeah, all that talk about philosophy is all well and good, but Garfield, when you talk about philosophy, you're talking about discursive practices. You're talking about thought and language and conceptuality. And we all know, because we've studied Buddhist philosophy, that conceptuality and language and thought are always falsifying. That they always implicate us with concepts, and concepts attached to abstract universals. They only give us things conventionally, not things ultimately, because ultimate reality is beyond conceptuality, beyond language, beyond description. And if full awakening, full Buddhahood, requires us to directly apprehend ultimate reality, then conceptuality is nothing but a hindrance. And then, yes?
Can you say in a little more concrete way, maybe with an example, what you mean when you say, what you're saying, talking about conceptuality?
I will, okay. So let me say that a little bit more, and then make the point. So when I say that when we think philosophically, we think in a way that implicates and involves conceptual thought. Here's what I mean. First of all, we use words. Like, for instance, suppose I say, here I am in a Dharma hall. So I've used the word Dharma hall. And I ask myself, well, what's the meaning of that word? Well, the meaning of that word isn't literally this place, because it applies as well to like the Amida Buddha Center up the road, It applies as well to the Tara Center. It applies as well to the Dharma Center and Tushita Center in Dharamsala. You guys have probably visited. It applies to lots and lots of places, right? So it's a word that expresses a concept, a universal. And the thing about the concept is, this is a cool thing about concepts. We're going to get into trouble with concepts in a minute, okay? And you can understand why as Buddhists we hate them, okay? We hate them. Here's why. Because, look, imagine that a very, very bad person, say John, decided that his life's mission was to close all the Dharma centers. And so he kind of went from center to center. Here's how he does it. He invites some crazy professor to give a talk. Everybody says, that's what happens at this center, I quit. And then he takes me off to the next center and closes that center up, right? And after a couple of years, we've managed to visit every center in the world, and they've all gone under because people are so upset by what I say. So at that point, there's no more Dharma centers. But the word Dharma center still means something. Because we could say, remember back in 2015 when there were still Dharma centers. So the word expresses a concept which doesn't rely on the individual Dharma centers to exist. We could have done the same thing with the word red. And suppose somebody just totally hated red. What's your name? Catherine the red hater. And so she goes around the world with a yellow paintbrush, and she paints everything that's red yellow. So there's no more red stuff in the world when she gets done. The concept of redness hasn't gone out of existence, even though the red things do. So we say that particular things might be impermanent, like this Dharma center, like red fire engines and things like that. But the universal redness, the concept of redness, or the concept of a Dharma center, that is independent and stays around. Now you see the problem. Because from a Buddhist point of view, everything that's real is impermanent and dependent. But these abstract concepts, these things we take to be the meanings of words, look like they're independent and permanent. So they're not real things, they're unreal, they're fictions, they're things that we make up when we use words and when we think thoughts. So when you engage, yes?
This is about concept
Yeah.
we're talking about. Doesn't it arise from thought?
Yes.
So you learn that and then you put that in your mind and you embrace it as a concept.
So we embrace the concept so it comes to exist. But the meaning of the word, the thing the concept expresses, like there could be Dharma centers, and there would be to imagine, the world cools. First it heats up, then it cools. There's no people left. It's still true that there were Dharma centers, right? So the universal seems to. Now I don't think this is right, but when we think about it in those terms, when we say that we're apprehending a meaning, we think of ourselves as apprehending something that goes beyond the instances. Now that superimposition, that's conceptual superimposition. Or when I say, I have now been talking for 20 minutes. Notice I've used the word I. When I say I'm talking now, what am I talking about? Talking about this guy in front of you now? Was this guy now in front of you 20 minutes ago? Absolutely not. The guy who was in front of you 20 minutes ago, he was younger than me. He was 20 minutes younger, okay? He was a different guy. The guy who's talking to you when I finish this sentence, he's a little bit older than the one who started the sentence, okay? The I imposes a fiction, something that doesn't really exist, but we pretend exists. So whenever we use language, whenever we use concepts, we find ourselves imposing a fictional reality on the real reality. That's why we get suspicious of conceptual thought, because it's engaging with fictional stuff. Things like selves, the guy who's talking to you, things like yourself, the listener, things like the Dharma Center, which are all in an important sense fictional. So, coming back to the point, does that help? Thank you. The practitioner sitting on her cushion says, I have no time for conceptual thought. I have no time for language. I have no time for all of that cognitive superimposition. I am on the road to awakening, and awakening transcends all verbal expression, transcends all conceptual thought, transcends all of that abstract philosophical stuff. So if you, Garfield, evil philosopher, try to enmesh me in doing philosophy, even if it's philosophy written by these heroes on the wall, you're just enmeshing me in more conceptual thought. And if you enmesh me in conceptual thought, you're not leading me to awakening, you're leading me away from awakening. I'm going to sit on my cushion and get beyond conceptuality right now. And it's that response, which I think is a very deep response in the Buddhist tradition, that I really want to discuss with you tonight. Because I think that while there's a motivation for that response, a legitimate suspicion of what we do when we talk and when we think discursively, it's fundamentally wrong. And it's going to be wrong for several reasons. And so that's where I want to take you now. So now, I want to begin by quoting a short passage from one of the guys on your Nalanda Masters, kind of right back there, the first one, Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna, I'm going to just say this again, was never at Nalanda. So just be careful when you get Nalanda Masters. Think of Nalanda Masters as people who were studied on the Nalanda curriculum, not necessarily people who taught at Nalanda. Some of them did. A lot of them didn't. So just always remember, get your history right, okay? So Nagarjuna died long before Nalanda was founded. It's important to remember. Anyway, so Nagarjuna, in his really great book, Mulamajamaka Karika, which is a book that I hope you will study sometime, Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, in the 24th chapter, says at verse 10, the Buddha's teaching is based upon two truths. A truth of worldly convention and an ultimate truth. If you don't understand the truth of worldly convention, you can't understand ultimate truth. If you don't understand ultimate truth, you can't attain awakening. So there's in that verse, there's a very clear hierarchy spelled out. If you want to understand ultimate truth that transcends expression, that truth that's inexpressible, that goes beyond thought and language, you've got to first understand conventional truth. And it's only when you apprehend ultimate truth that you can gain awakening. It's the no shortcut verse. It's one of the reasons that you probably in this center study Lamrim. Lamrim means a gradual path, right? It's not like we're going to say, okay, everybody fasten your seatbelts, tomorrow you're going to attain Buddhahood. It turns out to be a long haul. And for Nagarjuna, the point about the relationship between conventional truth and ultimate truth, at that early point in that chapter, because we're going to get to a different verse later in that chapter in a minute, but at that point is this. The path to direct realization is a path that goes through indirect realization, that goes through reasoning and inference, because we are beings with minds, but beings that reason, beings that see, beings that use language. And it's only by using what we've got that we can get to where we want to go. Here's a way to put the point. I'm going to put Nagarjuna's point in this way. If you think that what you're going to do is sit on a cushion and get non-discursive and then just find ultimate truth, then I'm going to ask you the hard question. How are you going to know it when you've found it? I could ask you to do something else. I could say, listen, instead of wasting all that time on the cushion, I got pills, okay? I got pills. And like in Singapore, you've got to be careful about these pills. But you take these pills, you can have these amazing experiences, and you're going to experience ultimate truth. So you take my magic pills, and you sit in the cushion while you have amazing experiences, and you say to yourself, wow, Jay was right. You know, you just take these pills and you get ultimate truth. That's a false, right? All you do is you get all kinds of hallucinations or something, right? Now, you could do the same thing by meditating in the right way. You could get yourself into a completely hallucinatory state, or you could fall asleep and start dreaming. People do that on the cushion, by the way. Or you could just get amazingly bored, or you could just delude yourself into thinking you've got this fabulous realization. And there's nothing about your own inner experience that validates it as an experience of awakening versus a dream or a hallucination or a profound confusion or serious mental illness, right? There's nothing about your inner experience that validates that. In order to know whether the experience that you're having in practice is an experience of awakening or an experience of insight, you first have to have a fix on what that would look like. And part of the task of doing good philosophy is to get that fix so that you know it when you see it. Now, a bit later on, Nagarjuna says, whatever is dependently originated, all conventional phenomena, this is verse 18, is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. There, Nagarjuna is taking the two truths, conventional and ultimate truth, and telling you that, guess what? They're not as different as you thought. They're the same thing. And this is also a point at which philosophy is needed. And it's only if we understand the relationship between those two philosophical remarks that Nagarjuna made, the remark at verse 10 and the remark at verse 18, that we can really understand what's going on in this profound philosophical system. It's easy to believe, if you do bad philosophy, that here's the relationship between conventional truth and ultimate truth. That conventional truth, like all that stuff I talked about, concept and language, that it's all this big illusion, that it's all just stuff that is completely hallucinatory and unreal, and that when you attain awakening, you know how you're going to know? It's all going to disappear. And what you're going to see is this great luminous void of emptiness. And it's going to be so cool. You're going to say, that experience, that's what I wanted. That luminous void of emptiness. All of the illusion has disappeared. There's no people. There's no Dharma center. There's no boring guy with a microphone. There's no nothing at all. It's just emptiness. You know what we call that? Being asleep. I mean, Buddhas who are supposed to have attained awakening, here's one thing they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be omniscient, right? They're supposed to know all kinds of stuff. They're supposed to know how to help other sentient beings. They can't do that with those sentient beings. It's like they can't even see them, right? So this idea that somehow there's the real world and then there's emptiness and that's what you want is a very deep philosophical confusion. We encounter that early on when you learn the Heart Sutra, right? When you learn the Heart of Wisdom Sutra, and you learn that what Avalokiteshvara saw when he contemplated the profound perfection of wisdom was that form is empty, emptiness is form, form is not different from emptiness, emptiness is not different from form. When you learned that, if you thought about it, you learned that conventional reality and ultimate reality are not different. They're not different at all. The ultimate reality is the fact that conventional reality is only conventional. That's easy to say and very hard to apprehend and to understand. I'm not suggesting, hey, have you quick, did I get you awakened yet, right? But that's important to see. And if you understand that point, then you understand the second and deeper reason why philosophy is essential to Buddhist practice. Because if you thought with that person on the cushion who said, keep your discursive thought away from me, I'm on the road to awakening, that there were two things, all that discursive thought, and then non-discursive awakened thought, then you thought that one of them apprehends conventional reality, and the other one apprehends ultimate reality. Then you had to think that ultimate reality was totally different from conventional reality. And if you thought that, then you forgot the Heart Sutra. You forgot what Nagarjuna was doing. You forgot everything that's important about Buddha Dharma. Namely, that ultimate reality is right here, present in conventional reality. And if that's true, then if you want to understand ultimate reality, understanding conventional reality is not just a stepping stone to understanding ultimate reality. It's part of understanding ultimate reality. The moment you disparage, Tibetan word is very nice, korda. It means to push down. The moment you disparage philosophical reasoning and thought, the moment you say, now I'm in the Dharma Center, take my shoes off at the door, leave my mind at the door, and just come and have a completely non-discursive experience. The moment you say that, you've deprecated your own thought, your own mind, conventional reality, and given that that is what ultimate reality is, you've deprecated the very thing that you were trying to study. Great Japanese Buddhist philosopher, one of my favorite Buddhist philosophers, Dogen, said, to study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to cast off body and mind. To cast off body and mind is to be affirmed by all things. That's very important. You begin studying Buddha Dharma by philosophically analyzing who you are and what you are. When you analyze who you are and what you are, you discover the emptiness of yourself, the emptiness of your mind, the emptiness of your body, the emptiness of all phenomena. You discover that not just by staring at it. You can look in the mirror for a long time and never find the emptiness of your own mind or your own body. You do that by rigorous analysis. And when you do that, and then you directly apprehend that emptiness, you find that you're affirmed as a conventional phenomenon among other conventional phenomena. A real thing that can be understood among other real things that can be understood. And so discursive thought is important at the beginning, it's important at the middle, and it's important at the end. But then what about all that practice? Why do we sit on cushions? Why do we try to look for non-discursive direct experiences? Why do we try to transcend conceptual thought? Well, we do that for important reasons. Oftentimes, what's most important about our practice is that it's our practice that makes it possible for us to reason, to think, and to do philosophy. So when we begin Buddhist practice and we cultivate shamatha and vipassana, a calm mind and an insightful mind, ask yourself, what's the purpose of that? Imagine this. Suppose instead of being like a Buddhist practitioner, you were, let's say, an Olympic athlete. We need to pick a sport. What sport should we pick? Let's pick sprinting. You're an Olympic 100-meter runner. Wouldn't you like to be an Olympic 100-meter runner? Everybody would love to do that. So anyway, as an Olympic 100-meter runner, what do you spend most of your life doing? You spend most of your life in the gym lifting weights, working under the eyes of a trainer, stretching, watching what you eat, and all of that stuff. You don't get a medal for working out at the gym, though. And you don't get a medal for stretching, and you don't get a medal for listening to your coach. You get a medal for what all of that makes possible. When you're cultivating insight, and when you're cultivating a calm mind, you don't get awakening that way. The calm mind and the insight are useful to you because they give you the focus and the patience to do the analytical work that you need to do to extirpate the ignorance, to extirpate the superimposition, to extirpate the primal confusion that lies at the base of attraction and aversion that gives you the release from suffering. Those are the exercises you do so that you can do philosophy. That's your work in the gym. The other part of it, though, is that when you do all of that philosophy, just coming to know that stuff doesn't get you released from suffering. As a psychiatrist friend of mine once said, it just adds insight to injury. So it's really nice to kind of know that form is empty and emptiness is form. And if you really saw that, you'd be a fully awakened Buddha. That's what made Avalokiteshvara so fully awakened in the Heart Sutra. But you all know that now, right? If you didn't know that, let me remind you, form is empty, emptiness is form. Form is no different from emptiness is no different from form. It still didn't transform you into Buddhas, did it? It didn't, because just that discursive thought going around is, just like that girl on the cushion says, just so much discursive thought. So then what's practice about? What's practice is about is not just doing the exercises, but taking that discursive thought and letting it settle into you so deep that it settles in just as deep as that innate primal confusion that Jay Rinpoche is talking about in Lecture Nyingpa. Because the only way that you can extirpate innate confusion is by digging so deep into your psychology that you replace it with clarity. And that's what meditative practice is about as well. But again, just like if all you're doing is meditating to get calmness and insight, that's useless unless you apply it to actually thinking. If you don't have anything to meditate on, if you don't have insight to meditate on, all that meditation is just plain worthless. The meditation that's going to sink these ideas into your soul, your no soul, into the deepest regions of your psychology, that meditation needs something to work on, and so that needs to be preceded by philosophy. So it's philosophical thought that's the point of meditating, and it's philosophical thought that gives you something to meditate on. Very great Chinese Zen philosopher, Zongmi, had a beautiful prayer where he said, "Let my practice polish the mirror of my mind so as to make it able to do philosophy. And let the philosophical thought condition my mind so that it's able to practice." Zongmi saw this tremendous non-duality between philosophy and practice. And that non-duality isn't just an artificial non-duality. You know, have you guys studied the Vimalakirtinudesha Sutra? I'll bet you haven't. Okay, I'm going to give you a scolding lecture now. Okay, can I scold for a little while? Here's the thing about studying Buddhism. Okay, I think studying Buddhism is really important. So you've got all these guys up on the wall, and all these guys wrote important philosophical texts. You've got all these guys up on the wall, and many of them wrote important philosophical texts. Now, if you know they wrote these texts, and you know they're so important that you have pictures of them on the wall, then you know what's even better than looking at their pictures? Reading their texts. Because you don't learn so much about their thought by looking at their pictures. You learn more by reading their books. I think it's a general theme in Dharma centers that people hear about philosophy rather than actually doing it and reading it. I'm here to scold you about that. The Buddha taught for 35 years, and he produced this huge canon of teachings called the suttas, the Pali Suttas. And then after that arose all of these Mahayana sutras. And there are different stories about their origin, but we think of those in the Mahayana tradition as Buddha Vachana, speech of the Buddha as well. So those are the things that the Buddha left us. Now I'm going to ask the hard question. In this center, which suttas and which sutras have you studied? I'm not hearing any. You've chanted the Heart Sutra. Have you studied the Heart Sutra?
We've studied the Heart Sutra.
I'm glad.
The boss.
Have you studied any other sutras or sutras? Any Pali Sutras? Any of the other Mahayana Sutras? Okay, so here's what's happening right now. This guy right here, Siddhartha Gautama, his statue's up there. He says, all you guys really respect him. You do 3 prostrations every time you come in. Imagine this. This is my scold. Imagine this. I teach philosophy at US. Suppose my students, I assign them some stuff to read, and they come into class and they do 3 prostrations. I'm already nervous, okay? And I say, so did you do the assigned reading? And they say, no, Professor Garfield, but we prostrated. That's not respect, okay? That's just silly, right? That's just not respect. If you had any respect for me, you would do what I told you to do, okay? Now, Siddhartha Gautama, I call him Sid. Sid wrote all this stuff that he wanted you to read, and all you do is prostrate in front of him instead of reading it. That's just like these mythical students of mine. My students show more respect to me than you show to Sid if you don't read what he wrote. So I am going to argue that you ought to be doing more sutra study. That's end of scold. But the scold is, if you really think of yourselves as studying Buddha Dharma, read some Buddha Dharma. And the foundation of Buddha Dharma is Buddha Vajna, the speech of the Buddha, because he wrote really smart stuff. And the Heart Sutra is a funny one anyway, because the Heart Sutra was written in China and then back translated. So it's a kind of weird sutra. So anyway, it's a good sutra, but it's off on the side. In the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, which I'm now going to tell you about, I'm also going to advise you to study. It's my favorite sutra. That's why I'm advising you to study it, because you should do stuff that I like. But the real reason is that the Vimalakirti is enormously, it's not influential in Tibet. And you're in a Tibetan Dharma center where everybody knows about the Vimalakirti Sutra, nobody reads it. The only time it gets mentioned is on Tibetan debating courtyards. There's a very famous insult that comes from the Vimalakirti Sutra that you could use in a Tibetan debate. I'll tell you about the insult in a minute. But it's very influential in Chinese and East Asian Buddhist philosophy. I think it's the foundational sutra for the Chan tradition. So it's very, very important. Anyway, I'm going to tell you the funny story about the Tibetan insult. I've got to tell you more about the sutra that I wanted to tell you about. So I'll tell you about the sutra. It's a good sutra. So anyway, here's what happens in the Vimalakirti Sutra, and it's kind of fun. In the 7th chapter, called the Goddess chapter, see, all these Shravaka monks and all these bodhisattvas have come to visit this bodhisattva Vimalakirti because he's pretending to be sick. And there's a whole big backstory, and there's a lot of good stuff that happens. But anyway, they've been there, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the discussion, this goddess pops out of a closet in Vimalakirti's house. And this poses this huge problem for the Shravaka monks, because as you know, monastic discipline doesn't allow monks to be in a house where there are girls, right? And so Shariputra, who's getting his butt kicked all over in this sutra, as he tends to do in Mahayana sutras, says to this goddess, he says, "How long have you been in here?" And she, being a goddess and a hero in a Mahayana sutra, says to him, well, like, how long has the Buddha been in liberation? And Shariputra, now he's like on the spot, right? And he says, I'm not going to say anything. He's silent, right? And the goddess says, Shariputra, everybody calls you foremost of the wise, smartest kid on the Shravakayana block, right? Why don't you say something? And he says, oh goddess, reality is completely inexpressible and indescribable. How could words say anything at all? That's what the goddess, she laughs at him, right? She says, give me a break, she says. She doesn't quite put it that way. But she says, you know, the Buddha talked for 35 years. If he can talk, so can you, right? So that's called the silence of Shariputra, where he tries to get out of a difficult situation by invoking the inexpressibility of ultimate reality. And the first moral of the story. You can talk about stuff, okay? That's the first moral of the story. Philosophy's okay. But then, 2 chapters later, the very famous 9th chapter, the non-duality chapter, opens in the following way. Vimalakirti asks all these assembled bodhisattvas, how do you enter the Dharma door, or the Dharma gate of non-duality? Now, that's actually important. Non-duality is a really important thing in Buddhism. Do you understand why that's so? Because the primary duality is the duality of self and other, the duality of I and mine. That's the basis of self-construction and self-grasping. That's the root of suffering. Duality is a bad thing. That's why when we chant the Heart Sutra, form is empty, emptiness is form. We're after the non-duality of conventional and ultimate reality. You guys all know that stuff. Okay, so he says, how do you enter the Dharma door of non-duality? So there's about 24 bodhisattvas who give answers. And they give answers like this. to say this is good and that is evil is dualistic, to transcend the distinction between good and evil and to simply act spontaneously, that's the entrance to the Dharma door of non-duality. Another Bodhisattva says, to say this is form and this is empty is dualistic, form is empty, empty is form. Another Bodhisattva says to say this is speech and this is silence is dualistic. They do all these different dualisms. And at the end, right, almost at the end, Vimalakirti turns to Manjushri, who's there. Him, sorry. And because Manjushri is the Bodhisattva of perfect wisdom, right? He's the embodiment of being really smart. So Vimalakirti turns to him and says, so what do you think about all this? And Manjushri says, well, they're pretty good answers. I'm thinking in my grade book, B+. They each get a B+, or maybe some get A-, right? They're all pretty good. But Manjushri says, this is the important part, their answers were all dualistic because they answered in speech. Speech and language are inherently dualistic, so even though their answers were good, they didn't transcend non-duality. To say nothing, to think nothing, to invoke no concepts, that's the Dharma door to non-duality. And then Manjushri turns to Vimalakirti and says, now you tell us about non-duality. And Vimalakirti remains silent. That's the second silence. That's the silence of Vimalakirti. Now, in doing so, notice what's happened. We start out with all of these expressions of non-duality, using speech, using philosophy, using discursivity. What do we learn from that? We learn at the moment of Manjushri that that's all pretty good, but you're not going to escape dualism by using dualistic speech and dualistic thought. And then from Vimalakirti, we get the moral of that story. Vimalakirti says nothing. But by saying nothing, he says something. He tells you what non-duality is. He gives you an articulate silence, a silence that means something. But notice that that silence is very different from Shariputra's silence. That's a silence that is able to tell us something only because all of the speech that's gone on around it. And so that very silence reveals the non-duality of speech and silence, the non-duality of ultimate insight and of conventional thought. But if that non-duality can only be expressed by silence, it can only be expressed by an expressive silence. And an expressive silence is itself a kind of speech and only makes sense within the realm of speech. So when you're on a Tibetan debate courtyard and you see somebody who's absolutely stuck in a debate and everybody says, oh, is this the silence of Shariputra or the silence of Vimalakirti? You know what they mean. Unfortunately, that's the only thing anybody in Tibet knows about that sutra. I'm serious. I have yet to meet a single Tibetan who's read that sutra. Tibetans don't read sutras, as you know. As you know, none of you are reading sutras. So, my advice to you, be silent. No, my real advice to you is read sutras. Yeah, Vimalakirti, 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 and there's a translation that's available online. There's the Bob Thurman translation. It was originally published on Penn State Press, but it's out of copyright. It's available online, and it's just called The Holy Teachings of Vimalakirti. And it's a pretty good translation.
Do you think that the Tibetan might have understood the Moho yet during the Samya debate about the silence that
Yeah.
and Sankarakista?
Yeah, the Samye debate, which of course, again, not a historical debate, a kind of interesting fable, is about this in a funny way, right? But it's about a caricature the Tibetans have about the Chinese traditions, right? Because the Vimalakirti is really big in the Chinese traditions, and this whole discourse of silent realization. And it's very different from the Tibetan system, which is a system of philosophy and analysis. So the Tibetans use the kind of Mahayana caricature as a caricature of somebody who doesn't have any thought at all. That has never been the case in the Chinese tradition. That's a total calumny on the Chinese Buddhist tradition. The Chinese have a parallel view about the Tibetan tradition, that they're a bunch of, eggheads who do nothing but logic chop all day and never do any meditation. And as you know, that's a calumny against the Tibetan tradition. These are just people who are kind of like, in different traditions. Protestants and Catholics do the same thing, right? I come from a Jewish family, and I've got an Orthodox wing and a Reform wing. They do the same thing. People like to have caricatures of each other. But here's one thing I will say. Sutra study repays itself. There's a reason that you have a statue of him there, and it's not because he looked really good, and it's because he wrote really good. And you really want to be reading some of them. And those guys up there, it's not because they were so cute you needed to have pictures of them, and it's not because their clothes were so interesting either. It's because they wrote really spectacular philosophical texts. And my feeling is that everything that I've learned about Buddha Dharma that's been worthwhile, I've learned by studying good Buddhist philosophy. And any time that anything I've done in Buddhist practice has been worthwhile, it's because it's been grounded in Buddhist philosophy. And that's why when John says, we'd like you to talk about something, Buddhism between philosophy and religion, I can't tell the difference. And that's really what I want to leave you with. Thanks. Other questions? Yes.
Do you think that Six Derrida will ever be a Buddhist, but with his use of language reconstruct? Do you think that the Prapancha, Paripatavita that we try to reconstruct in Buddhism will be?
There's a whole industry on Derrida and Buddhism right now, and it's an interesting industry. There's a lot that goes on in Derrida's work, especially in grammatology, that is kind of recapitulating a lot of moves that get made in Buddhist philosophy. That's not unique to Derrida, by the way. Look, I have two weird lives. Well, I have more than that, but at least two that are weird, right? One of them is I spend a lot of time in non-Buddhist cultures teaching Buddhist philosophy. I count Singapore as a non-Buddhist culture right now. And then I also spend a lot of time in Tibetan communities in India, where I teach mostly Western philosophy. Because, by the way, Tibetans have this idea that Westerners can't think. Yeah, they do. They think we're dumb. Should I tell you a story about that? I'll tell you a story about that. Okay. But anyway, and Westerners have this view that, like, Buddhists can't think, right? Because all they do is sit on cushions all day, right? So I spend most of my time trying to teach people that other people think. But anyway, the point is that it's not when I'm teaching Western philosophy in Buddhist contexts, and I'm talking about people who are going to make contact with the Buddhist tradition. There's a lot of them, right? There are people like Sextus Empiricus, there are people like Aristotle, there are people like Wittgenstein, and people like Nietzsche, and people like David Hume, people like Adam Smith. There's a lot of connection to these ideas. And that's because really good philosophical ideas are not the unique province of any particular philosophical system. I mean, we could have done the same thing if we kind of worked through the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi and looked at kind of classical Chinese Taoist ideas. We'd find things that are going to resonate with Buddhist ideas. And, Derrida is mining the very same territory that Nietzsche was mining. He's coming, the grammatology I think of as a kind of long footnote to Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, which is a text that has a lot of contact with Buddhist ideas, including the discussion of no self, of causality, things like that. I'll tell you a story, an autobiographical story. And I think it's instructive about philosophy and Buddhism. A long time ago, when I still had hair, when I was young, I was teaching a year-long course on history of Western philosophy at the Central University of Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, then the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. That's even when Geshe Samten was just finishing graduate school. He wasn't yet a professor, right? That's when we met. He was still a student. I was already old. Actually, we're about the same age. I've never quite figured this out. Anyway, so but he was still a student, and I was teaching, and we were hanging out there. But anyway, I was teaching this year-long course on history of Western philosophy, and His Holiness came down in December to do a big Kala Chakra initiation at Sarnath, And the then Vice Chancellor, Samdong Rinpoche, said to me, he said, you know, the director of the Institute for Buddhist Dialectics, Genlo Sangyatso, is going to be coming down, and I think they could actually benefit up there from your teaching. I'd like to arrange for you to meet him, and you could go up and teach some Western philosophy there for a little while. I think maybe he's trying to get rid of me, I'm not sure, but anyway. So he arranged this meeting, and I went to this tent where Genlo Sangyatso was staying, and he let me come in, and I explained to him what I was doing at Sarnath, and that Samdang Rinpoche thought that maybe he would like me to teach some Western philosophy up there in Dharamsala. And he listened to me for a while, and he shook his head very condescendingly, and he said, "Thank you very much for your offer. I understand why you've come to India to study Buddha Dharma, because our philosophical tradition is very deep and very vast, and it's very good that you've come here to study it. But everybody knows that Western thought is shallow and materialistic and concerned only with engineering, and we have nothing to learn from you. So thank you for the offer, but no thanks." So I thought, well, hey, this guy's from the Dialectics Institute, time for a debate. So I said, well, you know, we actually have some good books too, Genla. And he said, oh yeah? What's your best book? So I said, Critique of Pure Reason. And he said, okay, you come up and I'll give you 4 weeks. You teach this Critique of Pure Reason, and we'll see if there's anything in your system. So I went up there and I taught the Critique of Pure Reason to Genlo Sangyatso and a bunch of senior monks at the Dialectics Institute, and he was totally into it. He loved it. After about 2 weeks, he said, we have to translate this text into Tibetan. And I taught Western philosophy there for years afterwards. The point, though, that I'm making just is, it's not just Derrida, it's not just 20th century philosophy. Philosophy is philosophy. And there's no reason why you have to restrict yourself to Buddhist philosophy, to Western philosophy, to African philosophy, to classical Chinese philosophy, to any kind of philosophy, right? There's philosophy all over the world, and it's really fun to do. And you always find amazing connections the longer you play. Both the errors and the insights are all over the map. And I don't think there's anything unique about Buddhist philosophy in the depth or insight of the tradition. That's not to say it's shallow or not insightful. It's to say there's a lot of deep, insightful traditions in the world, and it's worth looking at all of them. Yeah, Derrida's fun. I wish you get right. Other questions?
Can you elaborate a bit more about Chandrakirti's critique of the use of syllogism as the Tantrika try to promote, and how the Prasanika come into being?
Okay, so you want the easy topic of the distinction between Prasangika and Svatantrika Madhyamaka. Okay, I can do that. Chandrakirti is my very, very favorite Indian philosopher, by the way. He's on the cover of my new book. So, Chandrakirti, where do we start? Here's where we have to start. Wind back to Nagarjuna. That guy over there is kind of obscured by His Holiness right now. So Nagarjuna in Mula Madhyamaka Karika in the very first verse, and everything happens in the commentary on the first verse. Says, not from itself, not from anything else, not from both, not from nothing does anything anywhere ever arise. Very famous verse. Very hard to interpret. Very profound. If you understand it, you understand a lot of Buddha Dharma.
Could you say it again, sir?
I could say it again. Neither from itself, nor from something else, nor from both, nor from neither does anything ever arise. So it makes it sound like there's no world. That's not what it means. It's a very profound discussion of causality and dependent origination, and we're not going to go there today. But here's where we are going to go. In the context of a very lovely commentary on that, the great scholar Buddhapalita, right over there, points out that the form of argument that Nagarjuna uses throughout Mula Madhyamaka Karika is what we would call in Latinate English reductio ad absurdum argument. That is, he reduces opponents' positions to absurdity. So you say to Nagarjuna, yeah, there is a real causal relation. Nagarjuna shows, I'm going to show you your position's incoherent. You say, but Nagarjuna, I can also show you there's a self. Nagarjuna says, I'm going to show you that's incoherent. So he uses arguments, he doesn't make positive arguments to tell you what the nature of reality is, but he uses negative arguments. And Buddhapalita says that's actually very important. He says it's important because Nagarjuna is trying to establish the emptiness of all phenomena. And the emptiness of all phenomena is the absence of any nature of any phenomena. So here's one way to understand what Madhyamaka is all about in a very short nutshell. We all have a drive to understand the fundamental nature of reality. We'd really like to know the fundamental nature of reality. And what Nagarjuna shows is there is no fundamental nature of reality. There just isn't one. Things don't have ultimate natures. They are empty of that. Emptiness is emptiness of any ultimate nature or fundamental nature. Now Buddhapalita said that's why Nagarjuna cannot use positive arguments, because the conclusion of a positive argument would be, this is how things are. Instead, Nagarjuna wants to show that any time you try to show how things are, it's going to end up being absurd. Okay, that's Buddhapalita. But then, a whole lot of interesting stuff happens in the history of Indian philosophy, including debates between a non-Buddhist school, the Nyaya, another non-Buddhist school, the Samkhya, and Buddhists. And at that point, philosophers like Dignaga and Bhavaveka, both up there, are beginning to develop a logic, a debate logic, that forms a basis for discussion between schools. And it's based on the Nyaya logic. And it involves a kind of theory about how you actually go about proving things. And you start out with some premises, and you have certain kinds of rules of inference and certain ways of using examples. We're not going to go into all that detail, but it's a theory of formal reasoning. It's not a very sophisticated theory, but an okay theory of formal reasoning. And they say, this is actually how you're supposed to do philosophy. So then Bhavaveka writes a commentary on Mulamajjhana Karika after Buddhapalita, and he says, Buddhapalita got it all wrong. He got it wrong in a very fundamental way. He didn't know how to write a commentary. Because a commentary, if you're going to show how a text works, what you have to show is how you can reconstruct everything that it says in a formal argument. And so Nagarjuna, in this text, he said, is establishing something, namely the doctrine that everything is empty of intrinsic reality. And to do that, he needs to have arguments that start with premises and end up, with rules of inferences and examples leading to conclusions. And so Bhavaveka writes a commentary, a very good commentary, a very profound commentary, where he reconstructs every apparently reductio argument as a positive argument for a particular claim about things. And that was very influential. And then Chandrakirti, the glorious Chandrakirti, right over there, responds and says, Bhavaveka, you didn't understand anything. Buddhapalita had it right. But his critique is very, very subtle. He doesn't just say, look, Nagarjuna wasn't using formal arguments, you fool, don't you see how the text reads? What he says is, look, there's a very deep reason that Nagarjuna didn't put things like that. And the deep reason is, now here's where you get to the subtle distinction between Prasangrika and Svatantrika. So, I'm going to back up one moment on vocabulary. First of all, when we use the language Svatantrika and Prasangrika, that language sounds Sanskrit. It sounds like words that you would have used in India. The deep dark secret is those words were made up by 19th century German philologists. They are not attested at all in Sanskrit. They don't appear anywhere in India. It's made up Sanskrit, and it's translated from Tibetan because it's Je Tsongkhapa who actually explicitly drew this distinction between two schools in a kind of history of philosophy. And the terms in Tibetan are Rangyupa and Telgyurpa, and they're back translated. So he created Sanskrit to back translate those, the Germans did, and now we all use that terminology as though it's Indian. So I want you to understand that that distinction was not thematized in India as a distinction between two schools of thought. Nobody said, hey, I'm a Svatantrika, I'm a Prasangika. Nobody said that. That distinction was drawn hundreds of years later as a way of systematizing Indian thought from Tibet. Okay? Just like if you think about the history of early modern European philosophy, you think there's rationalists, there's empiricists. Nobody at that time thought of themselves as rationalists or empiricists. That's looking back and systematizing it in retrospect. That's not to say it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. Because what we want to do when we do history of philosophy is kind of systematize stuff. But understand that these are Tibetan terms, not Sanskrit terms, even though they sound a lot like Sanskrit. But Chandrakirti draws the distinction that Tsongkhapa is really interested in. And this is part of the genius of Chandrakirti. He says, look, if you look at these rules of formal logic and formal debate that Dignaga and Bhavaveka are using, one of the most important rules is that the premises that you start with have to be agreed upon by both parties to the debate. That's really important. Like if you and I are going to start arguing, say, I don't know, about taxation policy, we better begin by agreeing about the basic economic facts and about what the taxes are and things like that. If we disagree about that, we don't have an argument to have, right? If we're going to have a disagreement about physics, we better agree about the fundamentals. So we're talking about two different things. So what Chandrakirti pointed out is that Bhavaveka presumes that the Madhyamika, right, that the person who's following the Garjana, can agree with the opponent about fundamental premises. But he says, you can't. You can't because the opponent understands the terms in the fundamental premises, of his argument, to be talking about the actual nature of things, how things actually are. That is, he takes the terms to be referring to stuff. So if we begin, let's imagine an imaginary debate that Chandrakirti might have in mind from that first chapter. The Samkhya's thought that causation was always self-arising in the fall. It's not a crazy doctrine. So take the analogy they always use, which is the seed and the sprout. They say the reason that a seed can give rise to a sprout is because the sprout exists potentially in the seed and is just waiting for other conditions to make it actual. And if you remember high school biology class, when you cut open seeds and you saw the little tiny sprout inside, you'd say, oh yeah. That's how it can give rise to the sprout. There's a teeny little baby sprout in there. And that's what the Samkhya is meant by causation from self. Okay? So, you imagine a Samkhya saying, look, causation is always causation from self. And now you want to imagine the Madhyamika arguing, no, causation is never causation from self. Now, they've got to begin somewhere, right? So they've got to begin with an understanding about what the words self mean and what the words causation mean. And the Samkhya figures, okay, there's a nature that things have, and causation from self is things that have a particular kind of nature, and causation is a particular kind of intrinsic relation between causes and effects. But Madhyamikas don't believe any of that, right? They don't believe any of that. So even if they're saying the same words, they mean different things. So they're not sharing premises. So the only thing the Madhyamika can do is take the opponent who's got a view about things and show that opponent that her own view leads her into absurdity. And that will cause her to do that. And if the opponent says, well, now you tell me what the nature of the thing really is, then the Madhyamika, if she's smart, is like Vimalakirti and says, there is no nature of anything. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The very idea of a nature doesn't make any sense. And so, what Chandrakirti points out is that if you use Bhavaveka's methodology, then you have to presume that the Madhyamika can say, at least for the sake of argument, let's agree about what these premises mean. We're going to say that conventionally, things have got these natures. Conventionally, causality is this kind of relation, and go from there. And as Jay Rinpoche said, that is to say that conventionally things have intrinsic identities, even though ultimately they don't. Whereas the Prasangika, the Tegyalpa, the wielder of reductio arguments, doesn't even think that conventionally things have any intrinsic nature. So you can't get that operation off the ground. So Chandrakirti's kind of insight into the debate between Bhavaveka and Buddhapalita was that what looks like a debate about how to write a commentary is actually a debate about very fundamental issues in metaphysics, namely whether, even conventionally, things have intrinsic nature. Does that help a little bit? Yeah.
Even that, can you say that Jay Rinpoche is a Swatantrika and Gorampa is a...
Oh, now we're getting into very deep waters. There are people who say that. George Dreyfus says that. Lots of Sakya heretics say that. I don't say that. I think Jay Rinpoche is a very, very subtle prasangika. And I think that part of what Jay Rinpoche brings out is the wonderful kind of robust realism within prasangika that does not require intrinsic reality.
He never revealed the use of Chatma, the Pramana.
That's right. I think, so Jay Rinpoche argues that you can use reasoning. Just, this is complicated. But when you're using reasoning, what you can't commit yourself to are the truths of the premises. And you can't commit yourself to to a certain theory of the meaning of the words. To go there, we have to go into Nagarjuna's Vigrahavyavartana for the theory of language that undergirds that. We're not going to go there. Yes?
I think I'm going to ask a really simple question.
Good.
So, what, in your opinion, do you think makes Buddhism a religion? And secondly, why, I fully understand why it's a philosophy and a really good one at that. But there seems sometimes to be a balance between the philosophical aspect as well as the rites and the rituals.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it seems to shift more towards the rites and the rituals.
Mm-hmm.
So why is there such a huge need for so much of the rites and the rituals that varies between the different traditions?
Yeah.
You have pujas in Tibetan, you have some Thai Theravadas. So, two-part question.
Yeah.
Simple.
Well, it's a simple question, I agree. Here's a simple answer. The reason that I say that you have to think of Buddhism as a religion is kind of like it's an anthropological category. It comprises lots of ritual behavior. It organizes people around sacred ideas. And that's kind of what religions do, right? So when we turn around here, I'm facing all of you guys, I say it's just philosophy. But if I turn around here and I see statues and water offering bowls and light offerings and all of that, then I say I'm in a religious place, not a classroom. And that's what's the kind of fun of having somebody teaching philosophy in front of all this stuff. It all gets kind of mushed together, right? So for a lot of Buddhists in the world, Buddhism is philosophically mysterious, but they know what the rituals are and the rituals organize their lives. I have a sister-in-law who said to me once, she's from a Korean Buddhist family, she said, Jay, you know about Buddhism, right? And I said, a little bit. And she said, well, I'm a Buddhist, can you tell me what I believe? And I think that's just a really common phenomenon. There's a whole lot of people who say, I'm a Buddhist, I have no idea what I believe, but I really believe it. I've got tremendous faith in something, I just don't know what it is I have faith in. But I think that's true of every religious system. That's why I started with that line from Ippolito Desideri, right? He's saying that's how Catholicism works. You've got a few people who know what it's all about, and a whole lot of people who've got tremendous faith in something they don't understand. So when we talk about something, when we talk about the word religion, right, what does it mean? Religio, right? To be tied. That's what it means. Same word as ligament, right? Something that ties something together. So religio is something that ties you. And Buddhism Buddhism ties people down in important ways. It ties their day down with morning offerings and evening recitations. It ties them down with monthly confessions if they're monks or nuns. It ties them down with ways of dressing. It ties people down with offerings to make and pujas to attend and things like that. And it does that, right? When you look at what human beings have done in their cultures, they've created innumerable systems to ritualize their lives. And Buddhism has done that. And if you try to pretend that it's not there, you're out of your mind. When people say to me, oh, Buddhism's just philosophical, it's never religious. I say, you've never been near a temple, right? You've never been near a temple. You can't say, you don't even know what you're talking about, right? You've never walked into a Buddhist culture, right? And seen people in their thousands circumambulating a holy site, right? You're telling me they're doing philosophy, right, when they're doing that, right? I mean, give me a break, right? But on the other hand, if I'm sitting down with, a monk friend and we're really working on a philosophical text and trying to figure out how to interpret it, which commentaries to read, if somebody's going to look at them, they're engaged in religious ritual. They don't know what they're talking about. We're doing the same thing that I'd be doing if I was sitting down with some white guy reading the Critique of Pure Reason, right? We're reading a text and we're trying to figure out what it means and we're trying to learn from it. And they're part of exactly the same community, right? So, yes, there's deeply religious aspects of Buddhism. Yes, there's deeply philosophical aspects of the Buddhist world, and they're all stirred together and mushed together, right? So, you go to a teaching by His Holiness, and he's explicating a difficult, profound philosophical text, and the next day he's conducting a tantric initiation. There's no problem. There's both of those signs are there in the Buddhist world. And it also, by the way, doesn't mean that if you do one of them, you have to do the other. There are people who want to simply organize their lives ritually and have great faith in something they don't understand, and that may make them very happy. And there are people who want to do a lot of philosophy and don't have any time for pujas and offerings and prostrations, and that works for them. And then there's people who do both, and that works for them. And I don't have any problem with that. That's how it is in every human culture. Every human culture. Yeah.
It's actually not a question, but something I like. Okay, philosophy and religion. I think my thinking is about faith.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'm actually not Buddhist, or what is Buddhist? I'm a Catholic. What is a Catholic?
Mhm.
So what you're saying about time down, I think, is basically, I guess, what you grew up with. Because I'm born Catholic, but I subscribe to the philosophy of Buddhism. Yeah. So what is going through my mind right now is basically, okay, so philosophy is basically what you subscribe to and you believe in it, whereas ritual is part of the religion. That's how I see it.
Okay, but I'm going to complicate it for you. So I'm going to complicate it for you in a way that I think might also help answer your question a little bit in a slightly deeper way. So the words faith and philosophy, or religion and philosophy, are, let's stick with religion and philosophy for a minute and then move to faith. If you think about religion and philosophy, they're both English words with Latin roots. Okay? So, the first one is Greek roots. Philosophy is a Greek root word. Philosophia, love of wisdom, right? So basically means somebody who kind of does a lot of analysis, eggheads. And religio, as we've said, has this kind of meaning of something, it's a discipline. So if you wanted the closest Sanskrit word to that, it would be yoga. Okay, yoga means discipline. It's the same word for yoke. So you could be yoked down, tied down, all kinds of ways to constrain people. So you think of it as a kind of discipline. Now, I'm going to do history for a minute. If we were in 13th century Europe, and somebody were to ask you, what's the relationship between philosophy and religion? People look at you like you were crazy. They're synonyms, right? Philosophy is the philosophy of the church, and religion is the religion of the church. And they're the same damn thing, okay? There's no difference. The words didn't even mean anything different. Now, what happened? Well, what happened in a word was Galileo. What happened was that the church decides to persecute Galileo, and Descartes looks at this and starts suppressing some of his work, and then scientists say, we just can't deal with this church anymore, right? There's going to be a divide between the church and science, and you got to take sides. And the people who did speculative stuff and sided with science, they were called philosophers. Now you can distinguish between philosophy and religion. Philosophy was the stuff that sided with science in the European Enlightenment, and religion was the stuff that didn't. And it became the difference between, now we'll get to the word faith, faith versus reasoned knowledge. Now, there's a great Mark Twain line that is definition of faith. He said, faith is when you believe what you know ain't so. So there was this idea that what faith meant was faith against reason. And you get that really nailed down by Kierkegaard, right? Who says that the really valuable kind of faith is really literally faith where all the evidence goes in the other direction. That's real faith, okay? Now that's an idea, that's a construction that could only move into European religion because of the threat from science. As long as you didn't have science, faith and reason went hand in hand. As soon as you got science on the one hand and the church on the other, then you got the valorization of faith against reason. Or the valorization of reason as a way of getting rid of faith. Took Nietzsche to see that those were two sides of the same coin, but that's a different story. Now, here's the cool thing. Ask yourself, what is the Sanskrit or the Tibetan word that gets translated as faith? In Sanskrit it's Shraddha, in Tibetan it's Tempa. Now, ask yourself what those words mean, and you get a very different valence. Because what they mean is justified confidence. You have Tenpa in somebody because she's proven to be a good friend, or Tenpa in a scientific instrument because it's well calibrated, okay? So it's justified reliance or justified confidence. Notice that's the opposite of what the word faith means in the postmodern context, where it's faith against reason. Now, this is one of the things, coming back to your question, that gives people pause when they ask, is Buddhism a religion? Because they expect to see faith against reason in a religion, because that's what you see in the Abrahamic religions. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you see a valorization of faith against reason. Whereas in the Buddhist tradition, faith is grounded in reason, whether successfully or unsuccessfully. I don't want to say that it's all works, right? But the idea is that you ought to only have faith when you can reason. Remember the Buddha's remark in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, a sutra which you should read, where the Buddha says, don't believe what I say just because I say it. Instead, try it the way a goldsmith tries gold. Pound it, rub it, stretch it, weigh it, and if it passes those tests, should you believe it. That's meant to generate Tenpa or Shraddha, and if you translate that as faith, notice that it doesn't work. Because if I tell you have faith in me, I'm telling you, believe it because I say it. Don't test it, right? Because we would think if you have to test it, you don't really have faith. On the Buddhist side, to get Shraddha or Tenpa, you have to test it. So that word faith doesn't work across the two traditions. The word religion doesn't quite work across the two traditions, because if what religion means is the opposite of science, it doesn't work in a tradition where you don't have a scientific tradition and you don't have an opposite and where you're valorizing reason. Does that make sense? Sort of. Yeah. So that's, but the question you began with was, what's that role of faith? And what I'm trying to explain is that the word we use in English to mean faith doesn't have a translation into Sanskrit or Tibetan. The closest word is confidence based on reason. And that makes it more like knowledge. It's different. Does that make sense?
Because I work at I teach at a very Methodist school, and most people are Christian and they don't understand Buddhism as such. And they always talk about gods, and I say, no, we don't have a god. Buddha is our teacher. Oh, well, it can't be a religion then, because if it's a religion, it has to have a god.
Right.
And they are absolutely, that's it.
Right.
If it's a religion, you have a god.
Right, that's because, just like with the word faith, the model of religion that many people have is based on the Abrahamic religions. So no anthropologist would say that, by the way, right? And no religious studies scholar would. An anthropologist, when they talk about religion, is going to be looking at rituals, life passages, way people organize their lives, institutions, and so forth. Pick all the anthropological tests. Yeah, you just try to say Buddhism's not a religion. You're just making it up, right? If you decide that a religion is something that orients you towards a god, then it's not, but that's a weird definition, right? All that means is it's not an Abrahamic religion. Surprise. But that's why I say that the categories are kind of complicated, right? And they don't always make sense when you move to a different arena. Because again, the word religion comes into use as a contrast with science or the secular. And Buddhism doesn't contrast itself with science or with secularity. And so it's the idea of trying to use an English term in a context where it doesn't belong. So, you could say to your friends, if what you mean by religion is something that's got a god, then you can use the word that way if you want, and then don't use it for Buddhism. But if you're using it the way that, say, anthropologists or theorists of religion do, then it's going to fit. If, on the other hand, you think that it has to involve some kind of revelation or faith against reason, it's not going to fit. So let's just take the word religion and put it in a box and actually just talk about what the Buddhist world looks like without trying to figure out which category to use. Any questions? Thank you very, very much for coming.
In relation to faith,
Oh.
do you think that our struggles are 大乘起心论 should be better translated into a different term? Because it is awakening faith in Mahayana.
Yeah.
What would be a better translation?
Yeah, of course, the Awakening of Faith is a totally apocryphal text anyway. It's a Chinese text, not a text written by anybody whose name was Ashvaghosha. So this gets doubly complicated, because now what we're really talking about is a Chinese term, not a Sanskrit term or a Tibetan term. And I'm not a sinologist, so I'm not going to talk about the best way to translate the Chinese term. And I would defer that one to somebody who really works in Chinese Buddhist thought. Yeah. But don't ever think the Awakening of Faith was written by an Indian guy named Ashvaghosha. I mean, again, I care about getting the history right. It's an apocryphal Chinese text.
Apocrypha, including the Heart Sutra.
The Heart Sutra is too, yeah, Heart Sutra is Chinese. I mean, it's become an Indian text, but, I mean, look, I'm sorry if I'm being heretical about the Mahayana Sutras, but remember, the Mahayana Sutras start appearing over 500 years after the death of the Buddha, and continue appearing for a couple of hundred years, okay? They appear in Sanskrit, and then later they start appearing in Chinese, right? Not much later, by the way. They start appearing in Chinese. Everything the Buddha taught was written down in Pali. I want you to imagine that I tell you, you know the story about them, right? With the Nagas and all of that, right? So now I tell you, I've just found this really cool new text by Descartes. It was written in English. And I'm going to show it to you now. I just found it. And yeah, I know that it doesn't look like the same language that Descartes wrote and spoke in. And I know that nobody's heard about it for the 500 years since Descartes and now, but that's because it was kept safe by Merlions. under the ocean and only revealed to me in Singapore. But I want you to believe that it was really written by Descartes, okay? Honestly, I don't think I'd be able to sell this text. Honestly, I don't, okay? That's basically what's going on when you want to say that the Mahayana Sutras are literally spoken by Siddhartha. You've got to buy a story that's about that implausible. Lots of people buy it. If your religious faith requires you to buy it, I don't want to disturb it. I'm going to tell you that I don't believe that. I do think the Mahayana Sutras are really important Buddhist sutras. I do think that within the Buddhist tradition, they are regarded as Buddha Vachana, that speech of the Buddha, and that there's a whole construction of that. If you read the 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra, the so-called Mother Sutra, which is the oldest of them, then you'll see that in the second chapter, I think it is, the sutra itself asks the question, what is Buddha Vachana? What is it for something to be a sutra? And the sutra itself says, it's well either for it to be spoken by the Buddha, we knew that, or spoken in the presence of the Buddha and approved by the Buddha, cool, or to be inspired by the Buddha and to be completely consistent with what the Buddha taught. Oh, that's interesting. So that I now say, do you know what it is to be Descartes Vachana, the speech of Descartes? That's to be spoken by Descartes, or maybe dictation taken by his secretary, or something inspired by somebody's reading of Descartes and completely consistent with it. Now, if you're if you're willing to accept that, that's fine. And I'm willing to accept that as a Buddhist construction of what Buddha Vachana is. And so I take the Mahayana Sutras very seriously as philosophical religious texts. That doesn't mean I have to think that Sid said them. So they're all apocryphal in that sense. The awakening of faith in the Mahayana is doubly apocryphal because it's a Chinese text pretending to be an Indian text pretending to be Buddha Vachana, right? Okay, so it's kind of like well out there. And all I would say is that, it's as fine a text as any, but if you're now looking for the real Ashvaghosha, then that's kind of crazy, right? He's a made-up author. And that's how it is. I'm going to stop here.
If we take
Oh, I'm not going to stop here.
the number 3, maybe we'll continue over dinner.
Go ahead, go ahead.
All right, I just want to clarify so there isn't a final confusion there. Apocryphal means not written by who they said it is. There's something wrong with the history.
Yeah.
So there's historical, a historical explanation. This is what Nagarjuna said. This is what this person. This is what Chandrakirti said. And we can have confidence in it as a historical.
Right, and the same thing's true of texts attributed to Nagarjuna, right? So there's a collection of about 6 texts that we know were written by the same guy. Mulamanjanaka Karaka, Yuktashtaka, Shanyata Saptati, Vaidalya Sutra, Vigraha Vartani, right? And so we talk about those and we say, okay, so define Nagarjuna as the guy who wrote those texts, okay? Define him. Now, there are several other collections of texts attributed to Nagarjuna. Oh, right, Navali, sure. Right, Navali's in that group, absolutely. And Sorlek is in that group. So there's a group of these texts that are definitely written by Nagarjuna. Now then there's this group of stotras, of hymns, that are attributed to Nagarjuna. Some people think, yeah, Nagarjuna probably wrote those. Other people think, nah, probably not. Some people think he wrote some of them, but not others. Then there's a bunch of medical texts attributed to Nagarjuna, and tantric texts, and metallurgical texts. And honestly, nobody who hasn't, grown up in a Tibetan library believes that those texts were attributed to Nagarjuna. They are full of material that didn't circulate anywhere in India until hundreds of years after Nagarjuna's death. So they're clearly texts that somebody wrote and said, gee, to get this published, I need a better name, call this guy Nagarjuna, right? But anybody who really wants to say Nagarjuna lived for, and you know how the Tibetans explain this, they say actually Nagarjuna lived for 900 years. So there was a whole lot of time for him to write these texts. And that's why all this really late material came, okay? Now You can resolve the conundrum any way you like, okay? If it's important for you to believe that Nagarjuna lived for 900 years, believe it. Catholic, a lot of people think Methuselah lived for 900 years, right? That's fine. You can believe that if you want. Here's another way to say it. There was this guy named Nagarjuna, maybe, and he wrote this group of texts. And then, in any case, whoever wrote them, we're going to call that guy Nagarjuna. Then there was a whole lot of other stuff attributed to that same guy, and we pretty much know he didn't write it. Now, people say, oh, there were 2 Nagarjunas, 3 Nagarjunas, 4 Nagarjunas. That's fine. You can do it any way you like. I don't care. I don't care. But when we talk about Apocrypha, there's Apocrypha every place, right? Did this person actually write this? We do the same thing with Caravaggio, right? So, you know, we've got a few paintings we know we can attribute to Caravaggio. Then there's all these paintings that, as the art historians say, are of dubious attribution, right? Were they painted in order to resemble Caravaggio's, or by somebody else? And someone like Caravaggio might as well be a Caravaggio, right? And so art historians spend a lot of time trying to figure out which ones are the real Caravaggios and which ones are apocryphal. With the Mahayana Sutras, honestly, unless you're deeply in the grip of religious orthodoxy, there's no reason to believe that they were spoken by the Buddha. If you are deeply in the grip of religious orthodoxy, believe that. That's fine. Nonetheless, they're important texts. Then you've got this huge literature of Chinese sutras. Again, if you believe they were spoken by the Buddha, you need a certain kind of orthodoxy. What I find fun about the Ashvaghosha is that it's not just, I mean, there's a lot of Chinese sutras. This is one that tells you, by the way, I was written in India, except there's no Sanskrit version. We're going to make up a name for an author and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of cute as a rhetorical device. But that's all it is. It's a cute rhetorical device for authenticating the text. And if you want to treat the text as an important religious text, that's one thing. And lots of Chinese Mahayana Buddhists do, and that's fine. But nothing in treating it as an important religious text, I think, should require falsifying its history. But if you want to, if that's important to you, go right ahead. You can say, yes, it was written by Ashvaghosha, this unknown Indian guy, and it was translated into Chinese, and then all the Sanskrit was lost. And it's the awakening of Mahayana faith. That's fine, you can say that, if you want. I'm just not going to support you in that. I'm just not going to go there. I'm not going to help support the rewriting of history in the service of orthodoxy. I have lots of friends who are happy to do that. I can refer you to them.
Well, my question was, do you think the concept of Buddhavacana is important anyway?
Yes.
Could you just...
Buddhavacana is a really important concept in Buddhism because Buddhavacana gives the text a kind of immediate authority. And this is a sociological importance, okay? So for instance, if you want to understand why the Huayan tradition is an important tradition in China, it's an important tradition because it's grounded in the Huayan, the Avatamsaka Sutra. Now, the Avatamsaka Sutra is an important Mahayana Sutra. It's a very important Mahayana Sutra. It's a Mahayana Sutra that was probably written in about the 3rd century BCE, about 800 years after the death of the Buddha. Now, for that sutra to ground a school of thought, to ground the Huayan school, it's got to be recognized as Buddhavacana. So Buddhavacana, the category of Buddhavacana, is a really important authenticator. The Vimalakirti Sutra that I talked about before is probably about a 1st century of the Common Era Sutra, about 600 years after the Buddha's death. It's called a sutra. That means it's recognized as Buddhavacana. That's why it can form a basis for the Chan school. So authentication is important. That's right. But don't pretend it's anything more than authentication.
Right, no fight on that, but are you bracketing it out as irrelevant to you as a philosopher?
No. I think I'm interested in the history of philosophy, right? And these ideas are really important. So, but do I think it was spoken by Sid? No, I do not. Do I think it's a text that's philosophically important for in articulating Buddhist philosophy? Yes. Do I think it's so important that it deserves to be called Buddhavacana? If Buddhavacana is like having a gold star, then yeah. Do I think it's important enough to be called Buddhavacana? If Buddhavacana means I've got to make up a fake story about sea serpents, then no. I'm not willing to go there. That's just me. Like I say, if you want sea serpents, there's plenty of people who are willing to give you sea serpents. I'm just not going to help you with that one. Any other questions? I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you.